Welcome to this webinar for the UK's Food Waste Reduction Roadmap. Today we'll be taking a walkthrough of the roadmap's data capture sheet, looking at what you need to be reporting on an annual basis in support of your roadmap commitment to target, measure and act on food waste. The latest version of the data capture sheet can be downloaded from WRAP's Food Waste Reduction Roadmap website, alongside measurement guidelines and other supporting resources. As a reminder, we ask you to share this with WRAP on an annual basis. You may have a particular contact within WRAP who will ask for your data submission annually, but otherwise there is the roadmap's email address which you can also use to send this document to. And as a reminder, WRAP won't publish this data unless you give us permission to do so through one of the questions within the data capture sheet, as we'll see. Otherwise, it's your responsibility and choice as to whether and how you publicly report. And we have separate guidance on that.
So this is the data capture sheet document itself, and I've opened it up within Excel because it's an Excel document. But if your business uses other spreadsheet programs such as Google Sheets, then feel free to use those. It will still work as well. And you can see before we get into the detail, there's a number of tabs and sheets at the bottom here. So we'll just run through the structure briefly. So it opens up to the guidance sheet. I recommend you read that ideally before, but at least alongside your data entry. We then have the data capture sheet itself, which is where you enter and input your food waste data and other information. And this is the only sheet in this document which you actually have to enter any information into. The next sheet is the food loss and waste standard principles that underpin the food waste reduction roadmap. So please make sure you're familiar with those. We then have some key definitions, such as on food and food waste itself, as well as inedible parts and the different destinations you can send your food waste and food surplus to as well. And it's important to be familiar with those to make sure you're aligning yourself with those so that we can make sure that you're being consistent with how everyone else is reporting as well, in line with best practice with the Food Waste Reduction Roadmap. And then finally, we have the reporting template tab. And this pulls data automatically from the data capture sheet when you've entered information in there. And what you can do with this tab is you can save it as a PDF. And if you choose to do so, you can, for example, upload it onto your website and actually report your data publicly. There are obviously other ways you can report publicly as well, such as through case studies, as we discuss elsewhere, but this is one option. And it's just a slightly more aesthetic way of presenting your information than the raw data on the data capture sheet itself. But in terms of what to share with WRAP on an annual basis, we'd ask that you share this whole document with us. Because we're able to pull the data from the data capture sheet into our systems, where we can do things like aggregate it, so we can track by sector and by the industry indeed at a high level how we're tracking against SDG 12.3. So if we jump into the data capture sheet itself and look at this in more detail. So the first thing I wanted to highlight was, this term here, FLW. So that stands for food loss and waste and comes from the food loss and waste standard, which as I mentioned, underpins the food waste reduction roadmap. But for the roadmap itself, we just use the term food waste. So where you see FLW, you can just read that as food waste if you're a UK roadmap supporter. And the reason it says FLW is that this is used at a global level, this template. So it's used by the World Resources Institute and others to collect data globally in support of hitting SDG 12.3. So the first section within the data capture sheet is company information here at the top, and obviously we ask you to enter the name of the business that you're reporting for, and this should be at a business level as you've in line with how you've signed up to the Food Waste Reduction Roadmap. So although you might have data by site, please do combine that aggregator when you report to WRAP on an annual basis. We also ask for the name and contact details of the person completing this report, just so that we can go back with any questions or feedback as needed. And then please also enter the submission date. So the next section is where we ask for details of the scope of your food waste inventory that you're reporting for. So first of all, you need to report for an annual period and on an annual basis. So please specify the start and end dates of the period here. And this could be a calendar year or a fiscal year, as long as you're consistent with that. So for example, if we're reporting for the calendar year 2020 here, you'd enter 1st of January 2020 to the 31st of December 2020. And please make sure that this spans a year inclusive of those dates. Next, you need to select the type of material you're reporting for. And there's a drop down here. So the options are, you either report for food and associated inedible parts within your scope, or you can report for just food and exclude the inedible parts. A definition of these terms can be found on the definition sheet, as I mentioned, and also please check out our webinar on food waste measurement for more details on these, then we'll get into here. And please note, if you only have food and don't have any inedible parts that can be wasted, still select the first option. You'll just report no inedible parts. Otherwise, it implies you're deliberately excluding them. And please note as well, for the UK roadmap, best practice is to report both food and associated inedible parts. So it should be the first option here. Even if you're reporting them as a combined number, you don't have to separately report them, but you should be including both in your inventory. Next, you select your food category. So you can see a list of them down here. And if you're reporting for multiple categories, such as for retailers, let's say, then you can just select the top option, all food and beverages. Otherwise, scroll down and select the most appropriate option for you. The next two options, continent and country, are there because this template is now a global template used by the WRI and others to support data gathering based on the food loss and waste standard, as I mentioned. But for the UK roadmap, of course, we just want your UK data. So obviously, please select Europe here and the UK here. In terms of business sector, please select the closest match to your operations. So that could be hospitality and food service, primary production, so in other words, on-farm operations, producer manufacturer, retailer, or wholesaler. And if you're more than one of these, if you have operations across these sectors, it's probably best to report for each part of your operations using a separate copy of the data capture sheet. And that's because the data is aggregated by sector. Even if you then separately combine your data across business sectors to aggregate for your business and when you're reporting publicly, for example. For life cycle stage, you should be reporting for your own operations as opposed to for your whole supply chain. And you can confirm that here. And, as you see fit, you can also add in the nature of those operations, for example, warehouses or manufacturing sites. Then you need to share how many sites you operate within the UK, i.e. within the scope of what you're reporting, of the nature of the type that you've specified above. So this should just be a number. You don't have to break it down by separate type of facility. So, how many sites do you operate within the UK? Then, how many sites are you actually reporting for? So ideally, these would be the same number, but you may be excluding some sites, and I'll talk more about that later. So it could be fewer, at least initially, and you might be working your way towards reporting for all of your sites. And then how many sites are actually contributing data? And again, this would ideally be the same number, but for example, you may sample some of your sites to gather data and then extrapolate your findings to other sites in your estate. So not all of them may be contributing actual data if they're based on extrapolation. So for example, you may have, let's say, 12 sites, all are covered by the report, but you've only measured at 10 of them, and then you've used that data to extrapolate or estimate food waste at the remaining 2 sites because you haven't yet put processes in place to capture that data. But the types of operations are similar, and so you can estimate based on, let's say, the volumes of food produced. Next is a really important number because it's used to calculate your food waste percentage further down in the data capture sheet. And this is the total tonnage of food that you sell as intended or place on the market. So it excludes any food that's wasted or sent to other destinations to avoid it going to waste. It's what you sell to your markets as intended. And that should just be a number, and it should be in tons as well. But there's some advice here if you're unable to get that figure. So some businesses may struggle to get that. Particularly for hospitality and food services businesses, you may have to get a different figure initially, for example, based on value or on number of covers, for example. And if that's the case, then on the next row, you can enter that alternative figure. As I say, that could be number of covers, it could be units sold, it could be sales value. If you're struggling to convert that into a tonnage, and make sure that you do include the units there as well and an explanation of what this number is. And it may be possible that we can advise you on how to estimate a tonnage based on that. Next, please confirm that the packaging weight is excluded. So, that should be the case. That means excluded from your figures here. In other words, but your total tonnage sold as intended, but also from your food waste and surplus figures below. And again, if that's not possible, we may be able to advise you on methods for estimating the proportion of packaging within your waste, so that just the food waste figures can be reported. And then finally, in this section, if you're reporting for on-farm operations, are you excluding crops not yet ready for harvest from your food waste figure? So you don't need to include pre-harvest losses when it comes to reporting your data, for the roadmap. So this should be a yes, or not applicable for those without on-farm operations. But food that's not harvested, but could have been, should be included, as it's one of the food waste destinations below, as we'll see. Okay, now you've defined your scope, the next section is where you input your actual food waste figures. So here we have a list of all of the food waste destinations, based on the definition of food waste that you can see in the definitions sheet. So that includes anaerobic digestion, incineration, which itself includes Cat 1 rendering for the meat sector. So if you're a meat processor, please see our sector guidance for meat processors. That's on the roadmap's website for more details about that. Land application, landfill, food waste or sewer or wastewater treatment, food that's not harvested or potentially ploughed in the field, once ready for harvest, relevant for on-farm operations, and then other as well, which includes the production of biofuel products, such as biodiesel or fuel pellets, etc. So it's important to note that this is still classified as a food waste destination and not as a biomaterial processing destination, which is a non-food waste destination that's covered below in food surplus. And please just refer you to our separate guidance on biomaterial processing for more details of that. So please do check that out. Within this destination, that includes biofuel products. You should also be including things like used cooking oil, that you may have used during food processing or cooking. And that's classified as an inedible part, but it should still be reported here. Please check our latest guidance on that. So look at the guidance tab, for example. And this is a change for some businesses, as we didn't previously ask for this to be reported here, but it does need to be included going forwards. So if you haven't reported this previously, you may need to revisit your baseline to adjust that. Or you can report it, if you're doing public reporting, you can separate it out. You can report it separately, alongside your other food waste figures. That's up to you. When presenting this elsewhere. But certainly for the annual data capture sheet that you share with RAP, please do include it here. And you can also add a comment, for example, in the notes section for this line to highlight what it is. And the remaining food waste destinations here are, refuse, discards or litter, and then finally not known. So if you know it's going to a food waste destination, but you're not sure what the breakdown is, then you can add it into the not known section and just specify that in the notes. So for each of these destinations, you need to indicate yes or no as to whether you send food waste there or not, or unsure if that's the case. The quantity then goes in this column, which should just be a number with the units defaulted to tons. So please convert it to tons if it's in another unit. And there's also space for additional notes as you see fit. And these could clarify if there have been any assumptions or estimates made, or if you know the source of the material, or anything else you think would be helpful to better understand your data. You don't need to put anything in the notes, but obviously use it to provide any valuable context as you see fit. And then this column here will automatically sum up to give you your total food waste in tons. So for example, if we, just in this example, we can put 90 tons here going to anaerobic digestion, and let's say a further, 10 tons to landfill. That then sums to give you the total 100 tons of food waste. The next line is also a key metric and is calculated automatically, which is your food waste as a percentage of all of the food that you handle as a business. And currently that's blank, because it shows that you're missing the food sold as intended figure, or the food that you place on the market figure. So, that shows as blank, as I say, until you enter that data up here. So if we put a figure in here, just as an example, then you'll see that now shows a percentage based on your food waste. And as you can see, that's calculated from your food waste, divided by all of the food you handle, which is calculated as the food you sold as intended, that you've entered up here, plus your food waste, plus any food surplus below that you send to food waste destinations to avoid it going to waste. And then scrolling down, we ask you to estimate the amount of food versus inedible parts in your food waste. So what the breakdown is for that. And you can leave these blank if you don't know that number. But if you know it, if you're able to estimate it, then please enter the tonnage here. And that's not broken down by destination. It's just for your total food waste. Just break it down into food and inedible parts if you know that. And you'll see a warning here if the total doesn't add up to your total food waste figure. So for example, if you enter, let's say 10 and 80 here, there's a warning, because obviously that adds up to 90, not the 100 that you put up here for your total food waste. So that there's a warning until you correct that. So as soon as you correct it, then the warning will go away. And as mentioned earlier, used cooking oil would count as an inedible part. So if you're able to estimate the breakdown of your food waste here, make sure to include the used cooking oil in the inedible part section. And again, you can see the food waste percentages automatically update here, as above, once you've entered data there, but for each of the, food and inedible parts separately. And then just scrolling down a bit further, so the other food waste data we asked for is your food surplus data. So food you send to other destinations to avoid it going to food waste. And please, make sure that you only include food here that would otherwise have been wasted. So again, there's a list of destinations here. So, redistribution, including charitable commercial routes, animal feed, and bio-based materials or biochemical processing, or not known if you know it's going to one of those destinations, but again, unsure of how that breaks down. So we can enter some data here as well, let's say 90 tons for redistribution and 10 to animal feed, just as an example. And the total updates here. And also, the figure showing your food surplus as a percentage of all your food handled. And you'll notice when I added the surplus in, if we scroll up here, your food waste as a percentage of all food handled, that's also updated, that's changed based on what I entered here for surplus food. And that's because your food handled figure has increased. That includes your food sold as intended, your food wasted, and your surplus food, as you can see. So when you add in surplus food here, it does increase the food handled figure and changes as a result of your calculation. And once again, you can break down that surplus food, into its components by food and inedible parts, with their sum needing to equal the total surplus shown here. Otherwise, there's a warning. So again, only do that if you know the breakdown. But if you know it, then put that in, and the numbers will automatically update. So next, section. So just scrolling down here, we have a question first of all about uploading your data to the Food Waste Atlas, which is an online searchable public database of food waste records. So that's one option for publicly reporting, and you can select from this drop down. So you can choose to allow the data you've shared on this data capture sheet to be uploaded to the Food Waste Atlas, including your company name. You can also choose to allow it to be uploaded anonymously, so the data will contribute to the database to help with things like aggregates, but it won't be attributable to you. Or you can choose to not allow the data to be uploaded to the Food Waste Atlas. It's your choice. So just please select one of those options. Then we have a section on quantification methods and uncertainty. And these are all free text questions for you to share, information as appropriate. So, just worth noting, you don't need to write an essay here. Some simple bullet points will generally suffice. But of course, share anything important that you think needs to be mentioned to enable your data to be interpreted correctly. So first of all, what data sources have you used in compiling your inventory? Is that external data from waste management companies, internal waste records, etc.? Just so we know where the data has come from. Secondly, have you used any guidance documents or references? So that might, for example, be industry averages, which you've applied within some of your calculations and so on. So just specify those if that's the case. Did you need to account for any water addition or removal? And that may be needed when reporting, food waste and sludge from effluent plants, for example. So, you should be including in your food waste figures the weight of water that was intrinsic to your food, part of your food, at the point when it became food waste. Have you done any sampling, scaling, or extrapolation? So, if so, please share the details here. And that could be, for example, measuring for a period of time only and then extrapolating to the full period, or measuring, for a subset of sites and extrapolating that to your whole operations. That may be a way you get going with measurement before, extending your measurement approach to your full operations. The next two questions cover any exclusions. So have you excluded anything from your data? So, any sites or products or categories or food waste destinations, perhaps because the data has been harder to get. And as I mentioned, of course, you should be working towards including everything within your operations, but that may take some time to fully realize, and you may be, getting going on the journey. So, please highlight any exclusions and the reasons for those. And then finally, is there any uncertainty in your data? So inaccuracies with measurement, gaps you're filling, industry averages you've used, etc. And highlight those at least, at a qualitative level. So list out where you think the uncertainties might be, if any. And if you know that at a quantitative level, then obviously, share that as well. So far, the data you shared has been around the measure part of your target measure act commitment. And we also need evidence of the target and act parts, which we asked for here. So although the section, says best practice, for the roadmap, we do require this evidence in order to recognize your business as an implementer of target measure act. So again, these are free text questions. Firstly, have you identified hotspots in your data you can share? So are there particular products, processes, time periods, categories, etc., where waste is particularly high? And that's important for you to know so that you can then look into the root causes in a focused way and develop a targeted action plan. The next three questions are around your food waste reduction target. And this needs to have a baseline year. So, when are you comparing against? A target year for when you plan to deliver against your target. And a food waste reduction percentage. And that's a relative reduction in your food waste as a percentage of all the food you handle. And we have other guidance available on setting a target, so I won't get into the details here. Please do check that out. But just as an example, if you adopted a 50% reduction target by 2030, and your baseline year was, let's say, 2020, then you'd enter 2020 as your baseline year here, 2030 as your target year, and 50% as your food waste reduction percentage. Okay, next, what actions are you taking to reduce your own food waste? So, the food waste in your own operations, which is what your target will apply to. And again, some simple bullet points will generally suffice. But it's good to understand the breadth of the actions you're taking in doing this. Then, what progress have you made so far in tackling food waste? And this can be looking at how you're tracking against your target, year on year. Are there any significant changes in your food waste percentage since last year? Has it increased or decreased, and what are the reasons behind those changes? And then within the commitment to the roadmap, we also ask you to work with suppliers and engage consumers to reduce food waste. So these two lines give you an opportunity to share some examples of what you're doing to meet that part of the commitment. And there's some examples there in the boxes as well, just to give you some ideas of the kinds of things that other businesses might be doing. Finally, there's an assurance and declaration section. So, firstly, use the drop down here to confirm, if your data has been, formally or, externally audited, or at least internally reviewed in some way. So it's not a requirement that it has to have been, reviewed or audited in this way, but obviously, these kinds of checks can improve confidence in your data. Where these checks have been performed, can you please provide some details of what's been done in the next line? And if that was actually a formal audit, that could include, for example, a link to a public assurance statement, just as an example. But again, that's optional, and there's no expectation that you would have done that as part of the roadmap. And finally, please confirm that this report is based on the food loss and waste standard principles that underpin the roadmap, which are outlined on this separate sheet, as I mentioned earlier. So please do review those. And the answer here, should be yes. If you've completed the data capture sheet using the guidance and the definitions that RAP has provided. So if you've got any query on those, do let us know. And then there's also space for any additional relevant comments or notes you want to share that didn't fit in with any of the existing questions. And that's really it for the data capture sheet. So hopefully that's given you a good overview. In terms of data, just to summarize, it's really just your food waste and food surplus tonnages by destination, with a breakdown of food and inedible parts where known, and the tonnage of your food sold as intended. And that's really it in terms of the data. The rest of the data capture sheet is really just to capture the context around those numbers, your scope and your measurement approach and so on, so that the data can be interpreted properly, along with details of your food waste reduction target and your actions as part of your commitment to target, measure and act.
Thanks very much for listening. So you can see, again, just as a reminder, our website address there, if you haven't already got that, where you can find this webinar, other webinars and all the guidance I've talked about. Our support email is there as well if you have any questions. That's all for this webinar. Thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to supporting you on your food waste reduction journey.